Hello, it's Dmitry again. This is going to be a little bit of a different video than I typically have been doing on medicine. This will be a video on a text called Pseudo-Orpheus, or the Testament of Orpheus. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to it right here before we get into the actual text itself. So let's begin. Pseudo-Orpheus, the poetic fragment called Pseudo-Orpheus, which in its longest recension contains 46 lines of hexameter verse, is widely regarded as a Jewish composition. Since it's ascribed to Orpheus by all the patristic witnesses in which it is preserved, it has traditionally been included in standard collections of Orphic material, but treated as a Jewish pseudepigraph. It is an oversimplification to refer to the work as a single poem. It is rather a piece of floating poetic tradition that existed in 2 or 3, perhaps more, recensions. It has been preserved in various forms by Christian authors, though one of them, Eusebius, says that a version of the poem was cited by Aristobulus, the Jewish philosopher who flourished in Alexandria in the mid-2nd century BC. In all of its forms, the poem has retained the basic structure of an address by Orpheus to his son Musaeus. Now, I actually tried doing this video just before, and I kind of just decided to stop it because I was just reading pages after pages of all this sort of introductory commentary about the history of this actual section and how it was cited by people like Aristobulus, Eusebius, St. Cyril of Alexandria, St. Clement, and so forth. All this sort of all these different kinds of people. And you would realize that because the text is not that long itself, it would probably mean that it's more of a video about the commentary about the historical development of the poem rather than the actual material itself. So what I'm going to do is just give you that little bit of an introduction. And I want to say this, maybe like give you a little bit more of a hint to you right now. So Orpheus was considered to be this ancient pagan prophet basically for Greeks. He was ethnically Thracian. Sometimes he's described as being from Pura, or maybe he might be associated with Adonia. Basically, he's sort of this somewhat foreign, not Greek, but, proximal to Greece kind of guy. He sailed with Jason and the Argonauts on the quest for the Golden Fleece. He is said to have gone to Egypt, supposedly, to receive knowledge or training at some point in his life. And therefore, that's how he was able to develop his rites and philosophy, his worldview, that kind of thing. He is said to have gone down into Hades to retrieve his wife Eurydice, and he's very obviously famous for being the one who can play the lyre. So he's quite a specimen, you could say. But he's a lot of the ancient wisdom that the Greeks attribute don't necessarily even go back to you think of like Aristotle or Plato or Socrates or. For them, at the time, they would go back all the way to the ancient philosophy, and from their opinion, of course, of Orpheus, essentially. And so it became to a point where people, if they wanted to say, oh, this thing that I'm cooking up, this philosophy, this idea in religion, in philosophy or whatever, they want to say, oh, well, this came from Orpheus. This is actually a thing that Orpheus came up with, and I'm just retelling it to you, right? And so you will see. A lot of what a lot of quote unquote Orphism is not necessarily this sort of category of stuff that's super concrete, where Orpheus said something and everybody wrote it down. Everybody knows what Orpheus is all about in terms of philosophy. More so, it's people who have a different kinds of philosophy and religions and belief systems and so forth, who sort of attributing their work to Orpheus because he has such great prestige to his name. The earliest versions present him as sort of like a hero figure in the same way that you might present maybe Heracles or Jason, or something like that. But as time developed, he developed more of a presentation as being more of a philosopher or a prophet. Remember that he's supposed to be, in some cases, the son of Apollo himself. So he takes on these more religious or philosophical roles as time progresses in the Greek tradition. And so people would attribute things to him when they're writing it themselves. And Pseudo-Orpheus is sort of in the same category. Essentially, Jewish authors attributed what was essentially a sort of like a Hellenistic, sort of like a prefigure to Hellenistic Judaism or to Judaism to Orpheus, and presents him as sort of being a guy who was theologically or philosophically akin to Judaism at the time, or the Israelite religion at the time, as practiced by the Jews. And so it's sort of in the same camp as all these other fundamentally, pagan works, where same way that pagans might be presenting, hey, this thing I'm cooking up right now in my poetry, actually Orpheus came up with that. This basically Jews were doing the same thing because, again, he was considered a very prestigious figure. So you can look at some of the stuff if you wanted to, I guess. It's kind of a lot. So I'm just going to go briefly until I can find something that I was looking for, which was a little diagram. I'm going to read recension A of this, which is the earliest recension that exists on Pseudo-Orpheus. And I'm also going to go read, I think, the Tübingen Theosophy, which is the latest version of this text. So here's a little diagram I wanted to show you. So this is showing you the 2nd century BC, where recension A is around the 2nd and 3rd century BC. I guess they said 2nd, 3rd century BC to 2nd century CE. I would say AD, yeah. So Anno Domini, 2nd century, or all the way back to maybe like 2nd or 3rd century BC. They have recension B, recension C. These go over into these texts there where there's commentary on them by people like Saint Clement of Alexandria. Eusebius is also is said to be quoting Saint Clement. You have Eusebius quoting Aristobulus, who was a Jewish philosopher, as we were talking about before, who lived in Egypt. Eusebius, okay. And then the most final version, which is very, very totalizing, tries to have everything in it and some more, I don't know what you call that. Is that the collector's edition? I don't know what terminology you would use for this. It's comprehensive, basically. Is this Tübingen philosophy, and it's presenting it as being from basically the 5th century, much, much later than this other material. Again, think about it here. This might be from the 3rd century BC, recension A, and then centuries and centuries and centuries later, you have this final composition of the Tübingen Theosophy in the 5th century. So it's a lot of, if you really think about it, how big of a time gap that is, it's really crazy. So, but this has just been hanging around, and I'm sure part of the reason it's been hanging around is because A, Jews continue to be a thing that exists, and Judaism is a thing that exists, and Christianity came on the scene and became very, very prominent in the Greek-speaking world, of course. So, it's probably a bit, literally the reason why we know so much about it is because of things like what St. Clement was writing about, what Eusebius was writing about, and so forth, and St. Cyril of Alexandria. So, it's precisely because people were quoting it in the Christian sphere that it became, still available, I guess you could say, for people to look back at. So I want to go read recension A first for you. Recension A, I was on page 152. So let me just continue. Okay. It's a lot of material they wrote on this stuff, and I'm like, okay, well, here's a bibliography. Or here's a bibliography. Okay, notes section. You want to go read the Greek? You can do that. I don't speak Greek. I can probably sound out some of the words here, but that's a big difference from doing that and actually in a meaningful, fluid sense, reading a sentence and comprehending what it means. So 152. So I'll go to that right now, or try to. Recension A. Oh, I love this. Is great. I can read. No, here's a Greek, right here. Read that if you want to. If you can. Okay. Hopefully you read that. See, it's not very long, right? I just showed you a bunch of text talking about, recension A or recension B, St. Clement of Alexandria, so on and so forth. And the actual poem is only this long, right? This is the original recension A. So let's read it. And another thing I want to say about this before we even get into it is that it's written like the way that an Orphic piece would be written, like how it introduces itself and stuff like that. It's written the way that an Orphic tradition would write itself, but it's distinctly not pagan, but explicitly monotheistic. So let's read it. I will speak to those to whom it is permitted. Shut the doors, you uninitiated. All of you alike, but you, O Musaeus, child of the light-bearing moon. Listen, for I am about to proclaim the truth. Let not the former imaginings of your heart deprive you of the blessed life, but look to the divine Logos and adhere to it. letting it guide your heart's deepest thoughts, and walk unwaveringly. Upon the path look only to the Master of the universe. He is one, self-generated. All things are brought forth as the offspring of this one. And among them he himself is superior, and no one among mortals sees him, though he indeed sees every one. And from good does he give mortals evil, both chilling war and tearful sufferings. And there is no other apart from this great king. But I do not see him, for around him a cloud has been fixed. For all mortals have mortal pupils in their eyes, too weak to see Zeus, the ruler of all things. For he is firmly established in the bronze heaven, on a golden throne, and he stands with the earth at his feet, and stretches out his right hand all the way to the ocean's edge, for around him tremble distant mountains and rivers, as well as the depths of the hoary blue sea. Yep, and that's it. That is the Recension A. That is the earliest version. It honestly, to be honest with you, right here and right now, it doesn't even sound that particular. It's using very overtly pagan language to describe like monotheism, because it's written for like a Greek audience, I guess. I mean, there's certain parts that sound very like almost like both in the Hellenistic Jewish but also in the Christian idea, like, but look toward the divine logos and adhere to it, letting it guide your heart's deepest thoughts, and walk unwaveringly upon the path, looking only to the Master of the universe. This kind of stuff. So that stuff sounds very, Christian in a certain sense. But they're obviously talking about Zeus and the golden. You could definitely see why it's included as part of the broader Orphic tradition, because it does kind of give that feeling to it. It's just that it's monotheistic. So, I wonder how long this commentary is. Well, let me give you a hint. It's a lot longer than the actual thing itself. I might read Recension B just for the sake of it, and see how it goes. Wasn't planning on doing it, but I might just do it now. Let me check. A lot of Recension A. Look at all this commentary for this one thing. Isn't that crazy? No, listen, I'm not saying it doesn't have value to it. I'm sure it does. I'm just saying, it's a little bit different situation. So here's Recension B. This is a little bit longer. Remember, that was 37 before. This is going to be how many now? 44. So let's read it. Let's read this now. So that was the original version. It's basically just monotheistic. It doesn't describe. Recension A is monotheistic. It doesn't describe anything about Judaism or the Israelite religion it might, you could say, arguably, it exists in the Greek cultural sphere, right? Greeks could read that and they could understand what they're talking about. But it's not. It's even though it's monotheistic, it doesn't explicitly attach itself to the Mosaic tradition, to the Israelite tradition. Okay, Recension B. I will speak to those of whom it is permitted. Shut the doors, you uninitiated. All of you alike, but you, O Musaeus, child of the light-bearing moon. Listen, for I am about to proclaim the truth. Let not the former imaginings of your heart deprive you of the blessed life, but look to the divine logos and adhere to it, letting it guide your heart's deepest thoughts, and walk unwaveringly upon the path, looking only to the Master of the universe, the immortal one. An ancient saying sheds light concerning this one. He is one, self-complete, and all things are by nature the offspring of this one. And among them he himself circulates, and no one among mortals sees him, though he indeed sees every one. And he himself from good brings forth evil for mortals, both chilling war and tearful sufferings. And there is no other apart from this great king, but I do not see him, for around him a cloud has been fixed. For all mortals have mortal pupils in their eyes, too small since they are implants set within the flesh and bones. Except a certain person, a unique figure, by descent an offshoot of the Chaldean race, for he was expert in following the course of the sun and the movements of the spheres around the earth, as it rotates in a circle regularly, all on their respective axes. And with wind, he creates currents around both air and stream. And he himself, on the other hand, is firmly established hereafter over the vast heaven, on a golden throne, and earth stands under his feet, and he stretches out his right hand around the extremities of the ocean, and the base of the mountains trembles furiously from within. And it is not possible to endure his mighty force, but in every way he himself is heavenly, and on earth brings all things to completion, since he controls their beginning, as well as their middle and end. For me to say anything other than this is not permissible for you, and in fact I shudder at the very thought. From on high he rules over everything in order. Yes, let me read a little bit minor commentary right here. Introductory remarks. Recension B expands recension A by including new material about Abraham and by adding a conclusion. It is primarily reflected in the portions reserved by Saint Clement, although traces of it are also seen in Eusebius. Okay. Yeah, so you can definitely see this section about what is kind of implied about Abraham. It's it's not being super explicit about it, but it's kind of like telling you about it, essentially. So, yeah, it's a little bit different. I also seemingly, I don't know how much fidelity they have in this translation, but they also don't mention the name Zeus. So they simply refer to God not by that name. Seemingly, although, again, I'm not sure how they did the translation, so I can't say that for 100% true, but I would assume that's correct. Now, those are the recension A, recension B. Those are the earliest versions. So recension A, that's the earliest. It's very, very limited. It's not very long. It doesn't mention anything about Judaism, but it's still monotheistic. It's using basically pagan Greek language to describe monotheism for them. This later one is starting to tie in actual, the Jewish tradition, you could say the Israelite tradition, into the actual work of Orpheus that he's citing. So from there, I'm going to go into the final version, which is the Tübingen Theosophy, which again is from the 5th century, it's assumed. And that's going to be on page 142. And I'm going to read that, not the Greek version. I'm not going to read the Greek version for you. Unfortunately, I'm not that good. Oh, that's interesting. So what they're doing here is that they're doing it page by page. So let's do that then. So let's read this out for you right now. So the Theosophia Tübingensis. Theosophia Tübingensis. That Orpheus the Thracian, son of Ogyges, at one time composed certain hymns to the abominable gods and related their unseemly beginnings. Then, as soon as he realized the impiety of what he had done, he turned himself towards that which alone is good, to the God truly worthy of hymns. And then, praising the ancient wisdom of the Chaldeans, especially that of Abraham, he recommends to his own son Musaeus not to be persuaded by these stories that were told earlier, but to turn his attention to the things destined to be told. And these things are told as oracles. 56. I will speak to those to whom it is permitted. Shut the doors, you uninitiated, since you flee the ordinances of the just as well as the divine purpose. All of you together, but you, O Musaeus, child of the light-bearing moon, listen, for I am about to proclaim the truth. Let not the former imaginings of your heart deprive you of the blessed life, but look to the divine Logos and adhere to it, letting it guide your heart's deepest thoughts, and walk unwaveringly upon the path, looking only to the Maker of the universe. The immortal one, an ancient saying, sheds light concerning this one. He is one, self-generated, and all things have come into being as his offspring. And among them he circulates, but him no one among mortals sees, though he indeed sees everyone. And they do not see him, for around him a cloud has been fixed, And he himself out of good things does not enjoin evil on mortal men, even so strife and hatred accompany them, as well as war, plague, and tearful sufferings. There is no other one, and he easily sees all things. You certainly could not see him, until at length on earth, my child, I show you, when I see his prince and the strong hand of the mighty God, even I do not see him, for around him a cloud has been fixed, for all mortals have pupils in their eyes. Too small, since they are implanted in flesh and bones, too weak to see the one who indeed rules all things. There remains both for me and for all men a tenfold layer of obscurity. For no one among mortals could see the ruler of men, except a certain person, a unique figure, by descent and offshoot of the Chaldean race, for he was expert in the movements of the stars, and of the spheres which always rotate around its axle, a perfect circle, all on their respective axes. And with wind he creates currents around both air and stream. He brings forth flames of fire, lighting up the whole sphere. He indeed is firmly established hereafter over the vast heaven on a golden throne, and earth stands under his feet, and his right hand to the extremities of the ocean. He stretches out on every side, and the base of the mountains trembles before him, in fury as well as the depths of the hoary blue sea. And it is not possible to endure his mighty force, but in every way he himself is heavenly, and on earth brings all things to completion, since he controls its beginning, but also its middle, as well as its end. As a word of the ancients, as the one born in the undergrowth set it forth, having received utterance from God, indeed the two-table law, but as it is not allowed to speak, I tremble throughout. With reason, from the heights he rules over everything in order. O child, be near to him in your thoughts, and do not abandon this divine message, but rather preserve it in your heart. And that, I believe, is the completion, or the end, you could say, of the Theosophia Tumingensis, or the most recent, most complete version of the Testament of Orpheus, or Pseudo-Orpheus. Now, obviously, I read the Recension A and Recension B, which are the earliest versions. Again, this is from the 5th century AD, the Tübingen Theosophy. While those earlier versions are from like the 3rd century or 2nd century BC. So you can definitely see some developments that are going on. You can see sort of this allusion to Moses talking about the two-tablet law. And obviously the preservation about talking about Abraham and so forth. And not to mention that even before we get into the poem itself, we're talking about this sort of prologue, talking about he repents of his paganism, his polytheism, his false religion, and how he's come to know the truth about basically the Israelite the sort of Israelite-like monotheism that he adheres to at this point in his life and teaches to his son Musaeus. Now, with that being said, it's not, even though it's the most comprehensive, certainly as it says 46 right there, it's not significantly more out there or more developed than I would say even the early recensions after Recension A, because I would say the big thing is the fact that they actually explicitly start mentioning stuff from the Israelite tradition, so like Abraham, for example, and that section is a lot larger. I would say, to be fair though, there's a lot of weight into just the actual forward itself, talking about his repentance from paganism. So that's very explicit in that version of it, I guess. And maybe that's been, I don't know, maybe that's been explicit for a while. Maybe that what they're phrasing on this page, it might have been a much earlier thing. I don't know what recension added that part on. It's presented here, of course, as being part of the final one at least. I'm not going to necessarily bother into looking each one to see which one actually had it initially or how they're presenting it in this thing per se. But basically, they give you a rundown from what I'm reading right now. This is I'm reading these for the first time for reference. It seems to be that the earliest recension is written by obviously a Jewish writer and is trying to basically frame monotheism in a distinctly Greek idea of it in a way that's not necessarily hostile to Greek paganism per se, or even to the way that they understand things. They talk about Zeus and they're talking about this, that, and the other. And like it feels Orphic, right? And it goes from that to where we have this final version, I guess you could say, where of course they're not talking about Zeus. They're just explicitly saying God. I don't know what in the Greek they're talking about. So let me do that briefly. Just see how they do that right now. Which verses mention that? Okay, let's go to verse 42. 42. 42. Oh, come on. Am I mistaken? I don't know. Sorry, but you know what I'm talking about. Basically, it becomes increasingly overt, explicit, either explicitly pro-Jewish or explicitly or pro-Judaism or pro-Israel, the Israelite religion, or pro-Christianity, potentially, arguably. I don't know. I mean, here's the thing, because it's being quoted by people who are Christian, like Saint Clement is obviously Christian, Saint Cyril is obviously Christian, and so forth. These are obviously Christian sources, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the person who originally wrote it is Christian. I mean, it's very likely that the person who first wrote the Recension A obviously is Jewish because it predates the time of Christ's life on earth. So that would make sense logically from a Jewish source. But the question becomes, what about all the other recensions that came afterwards? How much of that was Christians or versus Jews? It's hard to say. I would assume that a lot of it probably is Jewish in origin. I mean, the actual skeleton is Jewish, to be fair. And of course, the people who liked preserving it and teaching it were Christian, so I'm not sure. I can't say for sure. I'm sure they have some commentary on that, what they think. I couldn't say for sure. Regardless, though, I think it's a very interesting text. I think it's a very interesting way how it also went from, here's another point I want to say too, because we went from very implicit, like it's monotheism dressed up in a sort of a Greek Orphic tradition, into the final version of it, where it's a lot more explicit and it's a lot more, I would say, explicitly seemingly anti-pagan, where it doesn't want to associate itself with paganism anymore, really at all. It uses the word, again, it's using the word God instead of Zeus. Again, I know translation is a little bit complicated, but whatever. You understand my point. It's explicitly talking about his repentance of his paganism from the past. Obviously, it mentions Abraham. It makes an allusion to Moses. Well, I mean, to be fair, it makes an allusion to both of those figures. And so it becomes increasingly more overt, overtly, you could say, Christian or Jewish, and becomes more and more alienated from the pagan tradition that it theoretically is trying to appeal to, which is interesting. Because in the case of Orpheus, you would think the whole purpose of writing something like Pseudo-Orpheus is to appeal to the prestige of Orpheus, where people will say, "Oh, you like Orpheus? You're a big Orphic fan. How about this piece right here from Orpheus? Oh, it says you should be monotheistic. Okay, how do you feel about that? That kind of thing. You kind of get that feeling about it. But the end of it, it almost feels like what's really even the desire to appeal to Orpheus. I know a lot there were Christian authors who try to appeal to Orpheus because he is considered to be, as it describes in the introduction section, the best of pagan wisdom. That's the idea. That's the conception of Orpheus, is that he was a very wise sage of the pagans, and so he has a sort of prestige given to him. And so even from the Christian perspective, they might say, well, there is reconcilable or valuable parts of the pagan Greek traditions that we want to preserve or consider. Like, we don't necessarily say we throw away everything that Aristotle wrote because, he was a pagan. The reality is that the church was willing to reconcile certain aspects of these pre-Christian traditions in the pagan world with Christianity to a degree, within reason, right? They would want to comprehend what Aristotle taught without necessarily becoming worshiping Zeus and Hera and Apollo and all the rest. So I think it's interesting in that context, where we see as time progresses, it becomes increasingly detached from the actual pagan source material, which it's trying to appeal to, and increasingly being explicitly a fruit of sort of of the Israelite and arguably later on the explicit, potentially Christian tradition. Again, I'm not quite sure who wrote this most recent version, the Theosophia Tubangensis, but I'm not 100% on that. It is interesting to me, though, that the focus on the Logos is found in the original recension. Recension A explicitly mentions adherence to the Logos and then following it with your heart and stuff like that. That's the earliest version that predates Christianity. So I find that interesting in its own right. But to give you a hint, as you can imagine, I'm not a scholar. I'm not an academic. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a philosopher. And I'm certainly not a prophet. So I can't say that I'm particularly the most educated on these matters to give commentary on this kind of stuff. But I wanted to read it, and I wouldn't mind making a video about it. So if you enjoyed it, great. Hopefully it was of educational value to you. Regardless, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.